Flight 227 was halfway to Seattle, cruising calmly at 30,000 feet. The clouds below stretched like endless waves of cotton, glowing under the late afternoon sun. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was peaceful, a mix of quiet chatter, the hum of the engines, and the faint clinking of cups as the flight attendants moved down the aisle. Businessmen typed on laptops, a family shared snacks, and an elderly couple held hands, watching the sunset through the window. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Another routine flight across the sky. The girl in seat 17A barely noticed the beauty outside. She had her headphones around her neck, a worn-out notebook on her lap, and her gaze fixed blankly ahead. She was maybe 16 or 17, traveling alone. Nobody paid much attention to her, just another quiet teenager, lost in her own world. The cabin crew had smiled politely at her when serving drinks, but she hadn't said much in return. To most people around her, she was invisible. Then, without warning, the hum of the engines changed. It wasn't loud, just a strange low rumble that made a few passengers glance up. A second later, there was a deep, choking roar from beneath the wings. The plane shuddered. Coffee spilled. Someone gasped, and then silence. Complete, terrifying silence. For a few seconds, no one understood what had happened. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. The screens went black. The sound of the engines, the constant heartbeat of every flight, was gone. All that remained was the whistling of air against the fuselage as the plane began to glide through the empty sky. A woman screamed. A child began to cry. Overhead, the oxygen masks dropped with a sharp hiss, swinging wildly. Panic spread like fire through the cabin. People fumbled for the masks, calling out for help, their voices trembling. Flight attendants tried to stay calm, shouting instructions, but their own fear was visible in their eyes. In the cockpit, the pilots were fighting to restart the systems. But in the cabin, no one knew what was happening. The aircraft was still high above the ground, gliding silently. But the passengers felt the shift, the sinking sensation in their stomachs that said the plane was no longer flying as it should. The captain's voice came through the intercom, shaky but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've lost all engine power. Stand by." The announcement didn't calm anyone. People began to pray, clutching their seats, whispering to loved ones. One man grabbed the flight attendant's arm, asking if they were going to crash. She didn't answer. The cabin lights flickered faintly once more, then went dark again. In the middle of the chaos, seat 17A remained still. The girl looked around, her eyes scanning the cabin calmly, almost curiously. While others were panicking, she seemed to be thinking. Her breathing was steady. Her hands didn't shake. She looked toward the front of the plane, toward the cockpit door, and then down at her notebook, as if recalling something. Her mind wasn't filled with fear, but with memory. Flashes of her father showing her diagrams of airplane systems at their kitchen table. He had been a Boeing engineer, obsessed with explaining how planes worked. Even as a little girl, she had memorized the basics: air pressure, fuel flow, emergency power circuits. It had always fascinated her. She hadn't thought about those lessons in years. But now, at 30,000 feet, those same lessons flickered back into her mind like sparks in the dark. The plane jolted again. Overhead bins rattled. A few items fell into the aisle. A man shouted for the attendants to do something. Someone else began recording on their phone. The air was filled with noise, fear, and confusion. And beneath it all, the eerie quiet of the engines that no longer ran. The girl removed her headphones completely and placed them carefully on her lap. Her heartbeat quickened, but not from panic. She could feel that something was wrong, not just with the engines, but with the way the crew was reacting. If both engines had failed, they had limited time before they'd have to attempt a glide landing. Every second mattered. She looked out the window again. The sunlight was fading now, and the clouds had turned a dusky orange. The horizon tilted slightly. The aircraft was descending. She could feel the change in her ears, in her stomach, in the subtle shift of gravity. They were falling, gently for now, but falling nonetheless. Across the aisle, a woman was crying into her husband's shoulder. A young boy clutched a stuffed toy, staring at the ceiling. The attendants moved quickly, trying to comfort passengers, their hands trembling as they checked seatbelts and secured loose items. The captain's voice came on again, but this time it was just static. The girl unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. The man beside her noticed and said, "Miss, sit down." "It's not safe." She didn't reply. She simply whispered, almost to herself, "I think I know what's happening." The man frowned, confused, but before he could speak again, she stood up. Her movement caught the attention of one of the attendants, who rushed toward her, motioning for her to sit. "Please, miss, you need to stay in your seat." But she didn't sit. Her voice was calm, steady, and strangely confident. "I need to talk to the pilots," she said. "I think I can help." The attendant blinked, startled. "You, what?" The girl looked her in the eye. "Please." "Trust me," the attendant hesitated. Behind her, passengers were crying, praying, shouting. The plane continued to drift through the darkening sky, powerless. The engines were dead, the instruments fading one by one. And yet, in all that fear, there was something unshakable about the quiet girl in seat 17A. She didn't look afraid. She looked like someone who knew something everyone else didn't. For a long, silent moment, the attendant stared at her. Then the plane jolted again, and the decision had to be made fast. The attendant turned toward the cockpit, and the quiet girl followed. The door was ahead, closed, locked. The sound of alarms faintly leaked through. The girl took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had no idea if they'd let her in, or if they even could. But she knew one thing for sure. If she didn't try, no one else would. She stepped forward through the dim aisle, as the powerless plane continued its silent fall through the evening sky. Inside the cockpit, the air was thick with warning tones and flashing red lights. Every alarm imaginable screamed at once. Engine pressure, fuel flow, hydraulic systems, everything that could go wrong was going wrong. The captain gripped the control column so tightly his knuckles turned white, trying to coax the plane into a stable glide. His co-pilot frantically ran through emergency checklists, flipping switches and resetting circuits, but nothing responded. Both engines were completely dead, and the electrical systems were failing one by one. The aircraft, a massive Boeing 737, had become a silent, helpless glider cutting through dense gray clouds. "Come on, come on!" the captain muttered, trying a restart sequence. The engines didn't even cough, just whine noise and alarms. The altimeter needle was spinning downward. 29,000, 28,000, dropping fast. Sweat rolled down his temple. "We're losing altitude too quickly," the co-pilot said, his voice cracking. "We need to divert now, but divert where?" They were somewhere over the Cascades, with no visual contact, no radar, no GPS. The radio had already gone to static. All they could do was fight gravity and pray for a miracle. The captain's hands trembled as he reached for the emergency power switch. Nothing. Dead. The cockpit lights dimmed, and for a second, even the instrument panel went black. Down in the cabin, passengers felt the slow but unmistakable descent. The plane wasn't falling sharply. It was gliding, but every few seconds came a shudder, a reminder that it could end at any moment. The atmosphere was pure chaos. Flight attendants rushed up and down the aisles, trying to reassure people, but their own faces were pale with fear. Oxygen masks swung like pendulums. The air was thick with the smell of spilled coffee and panic. A mother held her child tight, whispering a prayer. A man tried to send a text message, but there was no signal. Another passenger sobbed into his hands, whispering that this was the end. Every small sound, a creak, a rattle, a whisper of wind, made people flinch. And in the middle of all that fear, a single voice broke through. "Quiet but steady. I can help," the girl said. The flight attendant nearest to her froze, unsure if she'd heard correctly. The girl, barely 17, stood in the aisle, her brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Her expression was calm, her voice soft, but there was something about the way she spoke. It carried certainty. The attendant blinked. "Sweetheart, please sit down. It's not safe to stand right now. I need to get to the cockpit," the girl said again, more firmly this time. "Please, let me in. I can help," the attendant looked around. A few passengers nearby had gone quiet, watching. "You can't go in there," the attendant said gently, trying to smile. Just stay calm. The pilots know what they're doing. The girl shook her head slowly. No, they don't. The plane lost all electrical power. If they don't reset the bus feed correctly, they can't restart the engines. It's not their fault, but I know how to do it. The attendant's smile faded. How could you possibly know that? My father was an engineer at Boeing, she replied. He worked on this model. I've been in simulators. I know the systems. Her tone was quiet, factual, not the desperate rambling of a panicked passenger. It was the voice of someone who truly believed what she was saying. Still, the attendant hesitated. The cabin was a storm of chaos, people shouting, crying, praying. And now this, a teenage girl claiming she could save a plane full of people. It sounded impossible, but when the attendant met her eyes, she saw something different. The girl wasn't shaking. She wasn't panicking. Her breathing was steady, her focus unbreakable. She looked not terrified but determined. Another shudder ran through the plane. A loud bang echoed from the left wing as air rushed through the engine nacelle. The cabin lights flickered, then dimmed again. Somewhere in the back, a passenger screamed. The captain's voice tried to come through the speaker, but it was just static. The attendant swallowed hard. "Stay here," she whispered, and hurried toward the front. The girl followed slowly, gripping the seats for balance as the aircraft tilted slightly downward. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, an endless roar against the fuselage. Every few seconds, a faint metallic creak echoed through the cabin, the sound of air pressure pushing against the structure of the plane. At the cockpit door, two other attendants stood blocking the way, their expressions grim. "No one's allowed in," one said sharply when she saw the girl approach. "She says she can help," the first attendant said, lowering her voice. She might know something." The older attendant looked the girl up and down. "Help? With what?" "You're a passenger." The girl's eyes flicked toward the door, where red emergency lights glowed faintly through the cracks. "The auxiliary power unit isn't kicking in," she said softly. "They need to isolate the bus feed before they can restart it. If they don't, it'll stay dead. They'll lose both engines completely." The attendants exchanged a glance. None of them understood what she was saying, but her certainty was disarming. "You need to sit down," one said, her voice trembling. The girl took a step closer, her voice firm but not loud. "Please, I'm not asking for much. Just tell the captain what I said. He'll know what it means." The attendants hesitated again, caught between protocol and the raw fear in the air. Finally, one of them nodded reluctantly and pressed the intercom by the door. "Captain, a passenger says she knows something about the power failure." There was a pause. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through, strained. "What passenger?" "She says her father worked for Boeing," the attendant replied quickly. "She mentioned something about isolating the bus feed." Silence. Then the intercom crackled again. "Send her in." The attendants turned, shocked. "Are you sure, Captain?" "Do it," came the reply. "We don't have much time." The girl's heart pounded as the heavy cockpit door unlocked with a mechanical click. The attendant stepped aside. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, the narrow hallway vibrating under her feet as the plane continued to lose altitude. The moment she entered, she saw chaos, flashing warnings, shaking controls, and two exhausted pilots fighting to keep the aircraft steady. But she didn't freeze. She walked straight to the central panel, scanning it like she had seen it 100 times before. She pointed toward a switch the co-pilot had missed. "That's where you start," she said quietly. "We can still bring it back." The pilots exchanged a glance, disbelief, confusion. But in that desperate moment, they did what she said. Outside, the frozen sky stretched endlessly. The plane glided silently through it, a fragile speck of metal and hope. And in the middle of it all, the quiet girl no one had noticed was about to do something that would change everything. The captain had no choice. Time was running out, and the altitude was dropping fast. Every second mattered now. The plane had already fallen from 30,000 feet to below 25,000. The cockpit smelled faintly of burning insulation, and the sound of rushing wind outside was getting louder with every passing moment. When the attendant's voice came through the intercom saying that a passenger might know something, the captain's first instinct was disbelief. But then he heard the phrase, "isolate the bus feed," and something inside him froze. That wasn't something an average passenger would know. That was technical language, something only an engineer or pilot might say. He glanced at his co-pilot, who was frantically scanning the emergency checklist. "We're out of options," the captain muttered. "Let her in." The co-pilot looked up, stunned. "You're serious?" The captain nodded grimly. "If there's even a 1% chance she knows what she's talking about, we take it." Moments later, the heavy cockpit door unlocked with a dull click. The girl stepped in, her face pale but steady. The red glow of emergency lights reflected off her eyes. The space was tight, filled with alarms, blinking indicators, and the constant scream of the altitude warning. But she didn't flinch. She looked straight at the control panel like she had seen it before. The captain turned toward her. "You said your father worked for Boeing," he asked quickly. She nodded. "He designed the electrical distribution systems for this series. He taught me how to fly it, at least in the simulator. I know what's wrong." Her voice was calm, clear and confident, even as the aircraft shook around them. The co-pilot blinked, disbelief written all over his face. "You're telling me you know how to restart this thing manually?" She stepped closer to the main panel, pointing toward the array of switches and levers. The engines failed because of a total electrical overload. The auxiliary power unit tried to start, but the bus feed wasn't isolated first. That locked the system. You need to cut power completely, then reintroduce it through the manual bus line. It's like rebooting the plane. The captain stared at her, speechless for a moment. It made sense. It actually made sense. He nodded once. "Do it." She sat down in the jump seat, leaned forward, and began moving with astonishing precision. Her fingers danced across the controls, flipping guarded switches, resetting breakers, and cross-checking readings. Her motions weren't guesses. They were practiced, deliberate, almost mechanical. The co-pilot watched her, still unsure whether to believe what he was seeing. "How old are you?" he asked quietly. 17, she answered without looking up. "But I've been studying these systems since I was 10. The captain watched the electrical readings begin to flicker. A faint hum returned to the panels. For the first time in nearly 10 minutes, the cockpit wasn't completely silent. "It's working," he murmured. "Keep going." The girl adjusted the fuel levers, ensuring the lines were pressurized. Then she reached for the ignition switch and reset the main power bus. The aircraft trembled slightly as a low mechanical sound came from deep within the fuselage. "Come on," she whispered under her breath. "Don't give up now." The sound grew louder, a faint cough, like the plane was trying to breathe again. The first engine sputtered, coughed, and fell silent. She tried again. "Cycle the bleed air," she said quickly. The co-pilot obeyed, his hands shaking as he followed her command. Then suddenly, a deep rumble filled the cockpit. The first engine roared to life. The needles on the instrument panel began to climb. The vibration of the airframe changed, steadier now, stronger. The emergency lights dimmed, replaced by the steady glow of restored power. One engine down, one to go. The girl exhaled and focused again. She moved to the second set of controls. Her voice was calm, but her hands moved faster now. "We'll use the bleed air from the first engine to relight the second," she said. "Keep the throttle steady." The captain nodded, his heart pounding. For the first time since the engines failed, there was hope. He glanced at the altimeter. They were below 18,000 feet and descending slowly. But now there was a chance. "Now," she whispered, and flipped the final switch. The second engine coughed once, twice, then roared alive with a powerful surge. The whole aircraft vibrated as the familiar hum of twin engines filled the air again. The lights in the cockpit came back fully. The autopilot system flickered back to life. Every sound that had once symbolized doom now became the sound of salvation. The captain let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You did it," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You actually did it." The co-pilot laughed, half in disbelief, half in relief. "I don't even know how to explain this," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We just got saved by a teenager." The girl gave a small smile, but her focus didn't waver. "We're not done yet," she said. "The system might not be stable. You need to hold the power steady until the backup generator is online." The captain nodded, following her instructions exactly. The girl moved through the rest of the reset procedure as though she had done it 100 times before. The alarms slowly faded. The cabin stabilized. Outside, through the cockpit window, the clouds began to break apart, revealing streaks of orange sunlight across the horizon. They were still high enough to fly, still far enough from the mountains to steer safely. The radio came back online, and the co-pilot immediately contacted air traffic control. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 227, he said into the headset. Both engines restarted, systems restored, requesting emergency landing clearance. Static, then a voice responded. Shaky but clear. Flight 227, we have you on radar. You're cleared to divert to Yakima Regional? Runway lights are active. The captain slumped back in his seat, exhausted but smiling. We're going home, he said. Then he turned toward the girl, who was staring at the instrument panel, making sure everything was holding steady. He reached out a hand. You just saved 189 lives, he said softly. She hesitated before shaking his hand. My dad always said planes are just machines, she said quietly. They don't fail. People give up on them too soon. The captain nodded slowly, his throat tight. Well, I'm glad you didn't give up. Outside, the engines purred steadily, slicing through the sky with renewed power. Inside, the tension began to ease. In the cabin, people felt the change too. The vibration returning beneath their feet. The faint hum that meant life, that meant safety. They didn't know yet what had happened or who had done it, only that something, or someone, had brought them back from the edge of disaster. And in the cockpit, the quiet girl everyone had ignored sat silently, her hands still resting lightly on the controls, as if she had been born to be there. With partial power restored, the aircraft sliced through the night sky like a wounded bird fighting to survive. The engines hummed unevenly, one stronger than the other, but they were running, and that was all that mattered. The plane had climbed back to a stable altitude, yet they were still dangerously low on fuel and running on limited systems. Most of the instruments had come back online, though some flickered uncertainly. Every sound, every vibration was amplified in the tense silence of the cockpit. The captain's voice, once trembling, had regained its steadiness. We're about 15 minutes out from Yakima Regional, he said, glancing at the girl seated beside him. Runway's clear. Weather's good enough for a visual approach. His words sounded calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the situation. One wrong move, one missed calculation, and all their efforts would mean nothing. The girl nodded slightly, eyes locked on the horizon. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a smear of oil on her sleeve from brushing against the console earlier, but her expression was focused, calm, and unyielding. We'll make it, she said softly. Just keep a steady descent. Don't push the throttle too hard. The left engine can't handle full power. Her tone was so sure, so composed, that the co-pilot found himself following her instructions instinctively. The cockpit was quiet, except for the rhythmic beep of the altitude monitor and the faint whirring of the restored systems. The radio crackled every few moments as air traffic control guided them in, their voices anxious but hopeful. In the cabin, the atmosphere was very different. The passengers, though still shaken, had begun to sense that something had changed. The humming beneath their feet meant life. The sound of the engines was the sound of survival. Parents hugged their children. Strangers held hands across aisles. People whispered prayers of gratitude, tears streaming down their faces. A few even peered out the windows, searching for the ground they had thought they'd never see again. The flight attendants moved carefully through the aisles, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. Their faces showed exhaustion, but also something like awe. One of them paused near row 17, where the girl had been sitting earlier, and stared at the empty seat. None of them fully understood what was happening in the cockpit, but they all knew that the quiet girl, the one no one had noticed, was the reason they were still alive. Back in the cockpit, the captain wiped sweat from his brow. Landing gear deployed, he announced. A faint thump echoed beneath them as the wheels extended into the rushing air. Warning lights blinked briefly, then turned green. They were approaching the airport now. Through the windshield, the clouds began to part, revealing a faint glow of runway lights below, thin golden lines stretching into the distance. The sight sent a wave of relief through everyone in the cockpit. There it is, the co-pilot murmured, voice trembling. Runway in sight. The girl leaned forward slightly, studying the instrument readings and the alignment of the approach. "You're coming in a little high," she said softly. "Reduce thrust on the right engine. Keep your nose level. Let gravity help." The captain obeyed without question. The plane began to glide down through the final layer of clouds, cutting through mist and darkness. The city lights shimmered faintly in the distance. The girl's voice, calm and unwavering, filled the cockpit. "Hold it steady. We're almost there." At 2,000 feet, a sudden gust of wind rocked the aircraft. The plane tilted sharply to the left. The co-pilot cursed, gripping the controls. "We're losing balance." "Counter with the right aileron," she said quickly. "Don't overcorrect." "Let it settle." The captain adjusted smoothly, and the plane leveled out again. The wind subsided, leaving only the steady hum of the engines and the faint, distant wail of sirens waiting on the runway below. At 500 feet, the runway lights were bright and clear now, glowing like a beacon. "Flaps full," she instructed. The captain extended them, feeling the drag increase. The plane slowed, descending in a controlled glide. "Speed's dropping too fast," the co-pilot warned. The girl's hand hovered near the throttle. "Hold it," she said softly. "Wait for it." "Not yet, 200 feet. The ground was racing toward them now. The nose was still a little high, but the descent angle was perfect. Rain glistened faintly on the windshield, catching the light. Every heartbeat in the cockpit seemed synchronized with the beeping of the altimeter. The girl's voice came again, calm and clear. "Hold, now flare." The captain eased the yoke back gently. The engines howled softly as the plane's nose lifted. For a split second, everything seemed suspended in midair. And then, with a heavy, beautiful thud, the wheels touched the runway. The sound that followed was the sweetest any of them had ever heard. The rhythmic roar of tires rolling safely against solid ground. The captain engaged the reverse thrusters carefully, guiding the aircraft as it slowed down. The lights of emergency vehicles flashed on both sides of the runway, waiting, watching. Inside the cabin, silence hung for half a second. And then, as the plane came to a stop, a wave of sound erupted. Applause, shouts, sobs of relief. People hugged strangers, clapped and cried openly. Some shouted, "Thank you, God," while others simply sat in stunned disbelief that they were alive. In the cockpit, the captain leaned back, letting out a long, shaky breath. He looked at the girl beside him, the same quiet teenager who had walked in as chaos filled the sky, and managed a tired, heartfelt smile. "You saved us," he said simply. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes were still fixed on the instrument panel, making sure every system was stable. Only when the engines powered down did she finally lean back, exhaling deeply. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We made it." When the door to the cockpit opened, the flight attendants and a few passengers who had rushed forward stood frozen in awe. The captain gestured toward the girl. "She's the one," he said quietly. "She brought us home." The attendant stared, speechless. The girl just shook her head slightly. "It wasn't just me," she said softly. "You all held together." As the passengers disembarked, many looked toward the cockpit, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious hero who had saved them. But by the time the last person left, she was gone. She had slipped quietly down the stairway, blending into the crowd outside. No interviews, no attention, no name given. Just a quiet girl in a faded jacket, walking away under the glow of the runway lights. The captain stood by the open door, watching her disappear into the night, the faint hum of rescue vehicles around him. He wanted to call out, to ask her name, but somehow he knew she wouldn't turn back. And so, her story became one of whispers, a mystery retold by those who were there. A quiet girl no one had noticed, who walked onto a plane as a stranger and left as the reason 189 souls lived to see another dawn.